The stone had already lived more than one life before anyone in the modern age bent low enough to read it. It had once stood as part of a public dedication in Caesarea Maritima, the Roman city by the sea, a city built to face outward, toward power, toward trade, toward the empire that stamped its will on Judea and expected to be admired for the effort. Later the stone was broken, shifted, reused, pressed into a staircase near the theatre, its first purpose forgotten by nearly everyone who set a foot on it. Then, in 1961, it was turned over again, and the buried lines rose back into daylight. Pontius Pilatus, Praefectus Iudae, a name, a title, a province. History can be very plain when it wants to be. The Gospels had long spoken that name without asking anyone's permission. Jesus stood before Pilate in Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, John 18 and 19. The creed later carried it into the mouths of believers who would never see Judea suffered under Pontius Pilate. That phrase is strange if one stops long enough to hear it. The confession does not anchor itself in a mythic reign or a half-lit age of heroes. It fixes itself under a governor, under a Roman official, under administration, record, rank, and sentence. Do not hurry past that. The Christian claim from the beginning was not that salvation floated above history, untouched by dates and offices. It was that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, John 1:14. In a world where prefects signed orders, priests kept their seats, taxes were counted, roads were measured, and bodies were buried in known soil. If that claim is false, it is false in public. If it is true in public as well. This is where many arguments begin in the wrong place. They begin with the largest mysteries first and become exhausted before they reach the ground. But the ground is patient. A city wall does not become pious because a pilgrim stands near it. A pool does not shift its location to assist a sermon. A funerary box does not scratch a more convenient name across its side because centuries later someone would like a better apologetic. Stone is not holy by nature, it is stubborn. That is why it matters. The question before us is not whether archaeology can prove every line of Christian theology. It cannot. No trench in Jerusalem can excavate forgiveness. No inscription in Caesarea can force love into a human heart. But archaeology can do something sharper than many people expect. It can expose lazy dismissals. It can show whether the Gospels move through a recognizable world or through sacred fog. It can tell us whether the story of Jesus is attached to the sort of names, places, customs, and tensions that belong to first-century Judea, or whether it drifts free like a tale unbothered by geography. The answer, step by step, is less dramatic than propaganda and more unsettling than propaganda. The answer is that the world around Jesus keeps appearing where the text said it would be. There is a difference between atmosphere and setting. Ancient fiction can create atmosphere with ease. It can say, "in those days," and move on. It can paint a palace no one can locate and set a miracle beside a river no one can identify. The Gospels do not read that way. Luke sets Jesus within the reign of Tiberius Caesar, under Pontius Pilate, Herod, Philip, Lysanias, and the high priestly orbit of Annas and Caiaphas, Luke 3:1-2. John remembers pools, pavements, gardens, gates, distances, and the line between one side of the city and another. Mark knows how a roof can be opened in Capernaum because that is what roofs were for in a place where people still had to breathe in crowded rooms. Matthew remembers coin, field, and governor because public death always leaves a paper trail of one kind or another. At first, these details can seem too small to matter. Then they begin to accumulate, and once they accumulate, they start to behave like witnesses. So let the stone in Caesarea remain before us for a moment longer. Not because it proves the resurrection. It does not. Not because it solves every debate about the historical Jesus. It does not. Let it remain because it does something both modest and irreversible. It confirms that one of the men at the center of the Passion was not a theological prop. He was a Roman prefect whose name could be carved in Latin and recovered under Mediterranean light. The governor in the Gospel story was not placed there by symbolic convenience. He belonged to the world the story claims to inhabit. That is how this path will unfold. We will not ask earth to say more than earth can say, but we will also not ask it to say less. A priest will appear in bone box limestone. Pools will appear at the city's edges. A house will open in Galilee. A boat will rise from mud. A synagogue floor will keep its silence. A quarry beneath a church will remember that it was once outside the wall. Two hostile or indifferent writers will name the movement that should have died. And over all of it, the Gospels will keep making the same risky claim. The one they called Jesus of Nazareth was here, not in the sense that poems are here, not in the sense that ideals are here. Here as in judged, touched, heard, followed, condemned, buried. That is harder to dismiss than a slogan. It is also harder to control. The governor's name, Roman power, rarely had to raise its voice. It preferred to sit. Pilate sat in the provincial seat of authority as the representative of an empire that understood distance better than tenderness. A man in Judea could die under a sentence that had been made possible by roads, tribute, military discipline, and the cold efficiency of rank. When the Gospels lead Jesus into the governor's presence, they are not merely adding a villain to the scene. They are placing him under the legal and political machinery that held the eastern edge of the empire in place. The inscription from Caesarea matters because titles matter. The surviving text identifies Pilate as prefect of Judea. That title fits the earlier Roman administrative pattern more precisely than later habits of speech. In the Gospels, the writers do not strain for Latin bureaucracy. They call him governor, using broad language that matches what Greek-speaking audiences would recognize. That restraint is worth noting. The texts are not trying to impress anyone with needless technical display. They are telling the story in terms their hearers can follow, while still placing Jesus beneath a real office in a real province. John's trial scene is especially severe. Pilate moves in and out, from Jesus to the accusers, from the pavement to the crowd, from private exchange to public sentence. He asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" John 18:33. He hears, "My kingdom is not of this world." John 18:36. He announces, "I find no guilt in him." John 18:38. And then proceeds toward the death he says he cannot justify. This is not the language of a mythic tyrant carved out in one color. Pilate is shrewd, irritated, cornered, cynical, and finally obedient to another kind of pressure. His office gives him room to act. His fear for his standing narrows that room until he begins to speak like a man who wants innocence to excuse him without asking sacrifice from him. One can almost see the moment his hand rests on the arm of the chair and does not rise. The political atmosphere around him was brittle. Judea was not easy to govern. Rome wanted order and revenue. Local elites wanted enough religious and social control to preserve their standing before the people and before the empire. Passover intensified every tension because memory itself was in the air. Israel's story of deliverance from foreign power was being rehearsed in a land still under foreign power. A governor during that feast did not need much imagination to understand how quickly a crowd could become a problem. This gives the passion narratives their terrible plausibility. The charge need not be metaphysically precise to be politically lethal. If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. John 19:12. That sentence does not sound like theology spoken in a sanctuary. It sounds like leverage. It sounds like men who understand what sort of nerve must be pressed if a Roman official is to stop hesitating. Loyalty to Caesar was not a decorative phrase. It could become the hinge on which a career swung open or shut. Pilate's inscription by the sea and Pilate's wavering in Jerusalem belong together. The first tells us he held the office. The second shows the sort of crisis in which such an office could be used. Between them stands Jesus, neither accidental nor abstract. He is not said to have suffered merely under oppression in a generic sense. He suffered under a named governor. That is the Christian scandal in miniature. The Son is brought into contact with state procedure. Luke quietly broadens the frame by placing Jesus in a sequence of public names before John the Baptist even begins to preach. Tiberius, Pilate, Herod, Philip, Lysanias, Annas, Caiaphas. Luke 3:1-2. The word of God came not to Rome, not to the palace, not to the temple bureaucracy in its settled comfort, but to John in the wilderness. Then it went walking toward Galilee and Jerusalem until it reached the judgment seat. The point is not that politics controls revelation. The point is sharper. Revelation enters the world politics already occupies. That is why attempts to dissolve Jesus into pure symbol always run into trouble. Symbols do not leave prefects behind them. Symbols do not gather executions under identifiable administrations. Symbols do not make later believers say, with stubborn specificity, that the one they worshipped was crucified in the governorship of a Roman whose name could still be read on broken limestone. Stay here a moment. Pilate is often remembered only as the man who yielded, washed, asked, and failed. But in the Gospels, he also serves another function. Almost despite himself, he becomes a witness to the kind of figure Jesus was perceived to be. Rome did not execute Jesus because he floated harmlessly above public life. Rome executed him because his existence had become entangled with kingship, crowd movement, priestly accusation, and imperial anxiety. Even the mockery placed over his head announces the nature of the charge. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. John 19:19. Pilate wrote more than he understood, and history kept the habit. The priest who stayed in office. Priests in Jerusalem did not merely pray, some of them governed by surviving. Caiaphas held the high priesthood for a remarkably long span under Roman oversight, and longevity in that office was no small feat. To remain in place through shifting prefects, public unrest, and the friction between Jewish devotion and imperial control required more than ritual competence. It required political balance, social instinct, alliances, caution, and the willingness to absorb pressure without appearing to bend beneath it. By the time Jesus stood in the orbit of the high priest, Caiaphas was not a ceremonial ornament. He was a man trained by years in the art of remaining necessary. Then, in 1990, a decorated ossuary was found in a burial cave south of Jerusalem. Inscribed upon it was a name commonly rendered as Joseph, son of Caiaphas. The identification is discussed with the ordinary care such findings require, yet the convergence is striking enough that even cautious readers pause. The Gospels remember Caiaphas as the high priest linked to the proceedings against Jesus, Matthew 26:47, John 11:49, John 18:13-14. Josephus also knows a Joseph Caiaphas in the priestly history of the period. Here again the world around Jesus begins to take shape not as a painted backdrop, but as a populated field. An ossuary is an intimate object. It is small because it belongs to the second act of burial, when bone has outlasted flesh and memory must settle into a tighter frame. Empires publish decrees on stone. Families gather remains in boxes. One world speaks in capitals. Another speaks in scratches, ornament, and grief. To think of Caiaphas through an ossuary is to be reminded that even the men who managed public religion were carried at last into the ordinary custom of the dead. The Gospels do not flatter him. John places on his lips the brutal sentence that it is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. John 11:49-50. John then reads that sentence with bitter depth, saying Caiaphas spoke more than he knew, because Jesus would indeed die for the nation, and not for the nation only. John 11:51-52. It is one of the great reversals in the New Testament. A political calculation becomes, in God's strange governance, an involuntary prophecy. But before it becomes theology, it is politics. Caiaphas would have seen the danger from his own angle. A Galilean teacher gathers crowds. He enters the city at Passover. The temple courts are disturbed. Messianic language begins to hover. Rome is never far away. A high priest who cannot keep order may not remain high priest. One man's life set against the possibility of wider reprisal begins to look, to such a mind, like arithmetic. That arithmetic has not disappeared from the world. When Jesus is led to the high priest's house, the hour is already compromised. Night hearings, hurried testimony, conflicting witnesses, torn garments, the demand for a direct answer. These details create not the smooth dignity of a fair tribunal, but the atmosphere of a leadership trying to make a dangerous problem settle before dawn. Matthew records the high priest's question with full force. "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Matthew 26:63. Jesus answers in a way that joins identity and judgment. "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Matthew 26,064, echoing Daniel 7:13 and Psalm 110:1. The room does not receive that calmly. The priest tears his robes. The charge hardens. One can picture the lamplight catching on fabric and rings, the servants listening from just beyond the main chamber, Peter somewhere in the courtyard trying to keep his body still while his denial forms in the throat. Inside, authority protects itself. Outside, loyalty gives way by inches. This is why Caiaphas matters historically. Not because finding an ossuary proves every detail of the hearing exactly as narrated, but because it confirms once more that the gospel world is not populated by generalized religious leaders created for literary convenience. It is the world of named office holders whose families buried them according to the customs of Jerusalem's elite. The conflict over Jesus did not occur in anonymous sacred mist. It took place within a traceable arrangement of priestly power. There is also a deeper theological sting here. The man appointed to guard holiness becomes central in condemning the Holy One. The institution built to remember covenant becomes an instrument in rejecting the one Christians would later call mediator of a better covenant. Hebrews 8:6. Yet the scriptural witness refuses simplification. Caiaphas is not presented as a cartoon of evil. He is presented as the sort of leader history produces in dangerous times, capable, calculating, convinced that order must be preserved even at terrible cost. That recognition is more sobering than hatred, and in the silence of the ossuary, one more fact remains. Caiaphas died. The office did not save him from the box. The calculations did not keep his voice in the air. The house where Jesus was examined is no longer filled with attendants. Bone endured a little longer than flesh. Then inscription endured a little longer than bone. Meanwhile, the name of Jesus, the man they judged expendable, traveled far beyond the chamber in which the decision was tightened. 5 porticos, 1 blind man, and the weight of place. A story that invents miracles carelessly usually invents places carelessly too. The Gospel of John has often drawn the sharpest skepticism because it lingers over long discourses, symbolic signs, and theological claims of breathtaking scale. Yet John also does something unexpectedly vulnerable. He names locations in ways that can be checked. Now there is in Jerusalem by the Sheep Gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades, John 52. For a long time, that sounded to some readers like the kind of ornamental detail a late writer might add to create atmosphere. Then, excavation north of the Temple Mount revealed a double pool complex whose structure accounts for the 5 porticos John described. This does not prove the healing of the man who had been ill for 38 years. Archaeology cannot recover the moment of command, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." John 5:88, or the first astonished strain of muscles answering. But it does something narrower and consequential. It shows that the narrator knew what stood there. Knowledge of place is not everything, it is also not nothing. Consider how the scene works. The pool is not decorative. It explains the crowd, the waiting, the local belief about healing, the gathering of bodies suspended between hope and disappointment. Sick people collect where rumor and need settle together. Bethesda is not just a backdrop for power, it is a reservoir of deferred desire. Jesus enters a place already heavy with waiting. He chooses one man from among many. The resulting controversy is then tied not only to healing, but to Sabbath, authority, and the identity of the one who acts with the Father's work in view. John 5:17, 4:18. That entire movement depends on physical setting. Then John does it again in chapter 9. Jesus sends the man born blind to wash in the pool of Siloam, John 9:7. The place matters because the sign unfolds through movement, clay, command, obedience, washing, sight, interrogation, division. Siloam lies in the lower part of ancient Jerusalem, tied to the city's water system and, in the late Second Temple period, to the life of pilgrims entering and ascending toward the temple. The rediscovery and excavation of the pool in the modern period have given new force to the narrative's local texture. This was not a pious nowhere. It was a substantial public site, stepped and accessible, fitted to the rhythms of a city whose water and worship were inseparable. Water in Jerusalem is never only water. It is survival. It is purification. It is memory. It is promise under pressure. When Jesus sends the blind man to Siloam, the sign becomes both bodily and symbolic. John himself pauses to note that Siloam means sent. John 9,000. The one sent by the Father sends the blind man to a pool named Sent, and sight emerges where water, obedience, and revelation meet. Yet the scene never loses its street-level realism. Neighbors argue, parents hesitate, religious authorities interrogate. The healed man grows in clarity while the examiners grow in resistance. By the time he says, "One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see," John 9:25, he has become more than a beneficiary of mercy. He has become a witness under pressure, and the witness is attached to a map. This precision matters because it exposes the laziness of sweeping dismissal. A text that remembers the difference between one pool and another, that places a healing near the sheep gate and another at Siloam, that ties topography to controversy and movement, does not read like writing detached from the city it describes. It reads like memory shaped by meaning, not meaning floating free of memory. But there is another layer worth keeping in view. Jerusalem in the Gospels is not a generic holy city. It is a city with thresholds, gates, paved places, and outer zones. Bethesda lies near the temple side of things, where ritual and waiting gather. Siloam lies lower, near the route of pilgrimage, where water and ascent meet. Jesus moves across such spaces with unnerving authority. He does not belong to one quarter only. He speaks in synagogues, in streets, in temple courts, by pools, in homes, on roads. He is at ease where categories are unrestrained. That alone helps explain why the reaction to him is so rarely mild. At Bethesda, he heals on a Sabbath and calls God his Father, John 5:17-18. At Siloam, he gives sight and creates a witness the authorities cannot control, John 9. At the temple, he speaks of living water in a city built on thirst, John 7:37-38. The geography and the theology keep touching. Let the reader breathe here, because this is one of the places where physical evidence and scriptural texture fit together without noise. No one needs to exaggerate the point. The pools do not preach. They do not carry inscriptions that say, "Jesus was here." They simply stand where the gospel placed them, in forms that make the narratives make more sense, not less. And when one sees that, one begins to understand why the historical question about Jesus is not answered by waving a hand at legend. Legends do not usually remember municipal waterworks with this kind of indifference to their own future credibility. A brief line is enough. The city remembered where the water was. A house with an open door, Capernaum, does not feel like an invented town because invented towns rarely have this much wear on them. The Gospels return there so often that the place begins to carry the rhythm of repeated footsteps. Jesus teaches in its synagogue, heals in its houses, meets tax collectors near its commerce, and crosses its shorelines with a familiarity that suggests pattern rather than occasional visit. Mark 1:21-34, Matthew 9:1, Luke 7:1, Peter's household especially becomes one of those ordinary sites where extraordinary memory gathers. Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law there. Mark 1:29-31. Crowds collect at the door by evening. Mark 1:33. Later, a paralytic is lowered through a roof because the room has no remaining space. Mark 2:14. A crowded house is easier to remember than a polished speech. Archaeological work in Capernaum has brought attention to a first-century domestic structure beneath later Christian commemorative layers, a house that seems to have gained unusual significance early, eventually becoming associated with Peter. The interpretive caution should remain. Archaeology does not hand us a notarized certificate saying, "This exact room belonged to Simon, son of Jonah," yet the pattern is meaningful. An ordinary insula, later adapted and marked out from surrounding domestic use, became a focal point of Christian remembrance in a town the Gospels constantly connect with Jesus' ministry. This makes human sense. Movements that begin in public squares can lose their beginnings in rumor. Movements that begin in rooms often keep their rooms in memory. People remember where the table stood, where the sick lay, where the teacher turned when the doorway filled. They remember the texture of crowding, the angle of light, the voice from the next space. If Jesus repeatedly entered Peter's household, taught there, healed there, and was sought there, it is easy to understand how that place would remain warm in communal memory long after the first generation died. Mark's account of the paralytic is one of the most physically credible scenes in the Gospels. The house is full. There is no path through the door. Friends go upward. They remove part of the roof and lower the man into the center. Mark 2:4. This is not grand architecture. It is improvisation born of urgency. Then Jesus does something more offensive than healing. He forgives sins. Mark 2:55. The scribes object inwardly. He answers what they have not spoken aloud. The healing that follows is both mercy and sign. It is also public. That matters because Christianity did not begin as a set of mystical interior impressions detached from shared spaces. It began in homes, on roads, in synagogues, by lakes, at meals, in upper rooms near courts and tombs. The house in Capernaum, whether or not every later identification can be pressed to certainty, belongs to that world of embodied nearness. A ministry that took place only in abstractions would not leave behind so many scenes dependent on architecture, weather, crowd movement, and domestic thresholds. There is tenderness in this chapter of the story too, and it should not be lost under evidential discussion. Peter's mother-in-law is not an exhibit in a case. She is a woman in a fevered bed in a fishing town, and Jesus takes her by the hand. Mark 1031. The whole city at the door is not a literary flourish. It is what happens when pain discovers a rumor of healing and begins to walk toward it. The lowered mat from the roof is not an apologetic detail waiting for modern archaeology. It is what desperate friendship looks like when the door is closed by bodies and the only remaining path is from above. A great deal of the historical force of the Gospels lies exactly here, in the way their theology arrives through scenes no one would bother to invent with such unembarrassed local texture unless memory, testimony, or inherited recollection kept demanding it. And notice what happens in Capernaum beyond the healings. Jesus also speaks hard words there. In John 6, after the feeding and the bread discourse, many disciples turn back and no longer walk with him. John 6:6-6. Capernaum is not merely a town of easy wonders. It is a town where following begins to cost something. Peter's reply, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." John 6068. Sounds stronger when one remembers it did not rise from a vacuum. It rose from a place where meals had been shared, sickness interrupted, crowds pressed in, and offense had become unavoidable. So the house stands before us, partly recovered, partly remembered, partly veiled by centuries of veneration. And that is fitting. Much of the world of Jesus reaches us this way, enough to sharpen outline, not enough to remove the need for judgment, enough to steady memory, not enough to cancel faith. The domestic scale of it all is perhaps the most arresting feature. the one Christians confess as Lord of Glory entered lives through doors low enough to stoop under. Timber on the Galilee empires leave inscriptions. Lakes leave wood, if mercy holds long enough in the mud. In 1986, during a season of low water along the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, the remains of an ancient boat were discovered near Ginosar. Radiocarbon dating and associated study placed it broadly between the late 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. That range matters because it falls within the world of Jesus and his first followers, the very world in which fishermen worked the lake. Crossings were common, storms could rise with frightening speed, and boats were not scenic accessories but the grammar of labor. The boat is often spoken of too quickly, as though the mere existence of a 1st century Galilean vessel proves every narrative in which Jesus enters one. It does not, but it gives weight and proportion to those stories. It shows the scale, construction, and material reality of the craft that belonged to that lake in that time. When the Gospels tell us that Jesus got into a boat and taught the crowds from the water, Luke 5:33, or that he crossed the sea with his disciples and the storm broke upon them, Mark 4:35-38. They are not speaking of timeless symbolism detached from working life. They are speaking the language of a region where lakecraft shaped daily movement and income. One can almost smell the wet rope. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were not ornamental fishermen placed in the story to supply a rural mood. Nets, boats, partners, hired men. These details belong to the economic life of Galilee, Mark 1016-20. The call of Jesus comes into that life without pretending it was ever simple. A man mending a net is already living under Rome, under taxes, under uncertain yield, under the endless bargain between toil and enough. Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men. Mark 1:17 is therefore not a decorative metaphor. It is a redirection of trade, skill, risk, and endurance. Then there is Magdala. The discovery of the 1st century synagogue there in 2009 widened the visible world around Jesus' Galilean ministry. The town, long associated with Mary Magdalene by tradition of place and name, yielded a synagogue of the right period and notable significance, including the carved stone now known as the Magdala stone. The find confirms once more that Galilee in Jesus' time was neither empty nor religiously thin. It was populated, structured, economically active, and full of Jewish communal life. Synagogues were not later projections backward. They belonged to the lived environment in which a teacher like Jesus would speak. Luke says Jesus came to Nazareth and read in the synagogue from Isaiah. Luke 4:16-21. Mark says he taught in synagogues throughout Galilee, Mark 1039. The Magdala synagogue does not prove he stood in that exact room on a given Sabbath, yet it clarifies the world those statements describe. A 1st century Galilean synagogue was not fantasy. It had stone floor, communal memory, local prestige, and scriptural centrality. Jesus' teaching ministry belongs there naturally. This chapter of the story matters for another reason. It reveals how deeply Jewish the world of Jesus remained. The modern imagination is often tempted to place Jesus against Judaism as though he arrived from nowhere to speak against a flat religious background. The archaeology of Galilee resists that distortion. Synagogue, ritual life, trade, pilgrimage routes, fishing economy, village networks. Jesus moved within Israel's world. He disputed interpretations inside that world. He fulfilled and judged from within that world. He went to Jerusalem for feasts within that world. Even his sharpest confrontations with leaders make sense only because the covenant history of Israel is already present and pressing. A long breath belongs here. If one stands too far from the lake, the gospel scenes can become stained glass before they become history. Boats drift on symbolic water, disciples turn into devotional silhouettes, and the call narrative loses the roughness of trade. But the recovered vessel in Galilee, plain and weathered, refuses that softening. So does the synagogue in Magdala. So do the villages clustered around the shore. Jesus did not deliver a philosophy from a placeless cloud. He walked a Jewish landscape thick with labor, scripture, family ties, disease, taxation, and expectation. The kingdom of God, he proclaimed, entered a region where men smelled of fish, where women kept households through scarcity, where local assemblies heard Torah, and where crowds could gather fast because hope travels quickly in compressed worlds. That helps explain the volatility of the ministry. The lake spread news, villages held memory, synagogues offered hearing, Capernaum became a base, Magdala sat along a lively zone of movement. Tax booths and fishing enterprise created contact with the broader systems of power and exchange. A teacher who healed, forgave, disputed, warned, and drew crowds in that region would not remain a private figure for long. Even the storm narratives feel different once timber has returned to the conversation. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Mark 4:38. The disciples cry while Jesus sleeps on the cushion. That line does not sound like liturgical invention polished by centuries. It sounds like men in a boat small enough to fear being swallowed. And after the fear, the question emerges, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Mark 4:41. The archaeology of Galilee cannot answer that question. It can, however, make clear that the men who asked it were not drifting through legend. The press of Olives Night in the Gospels often arrives with decision already underway. Gethsemane lies on the slope of the Mount of Olives, east of the city, in a place whose very name suggests pressing, the crushing of olives into oil. The setting is fitting in a way one hesitates to call poetic, because the fit is too severe. Jesus goes there after the meal to a place he and his disciples seem to know well, John 18:2. It is close enough to the city for Judas to lead a group there, yet apart enough for prayer. The area bears long tradition, ancient agricultural use, and burial surroundings consistent with the edges of Jerusalem in that period. The modern visitor encounters churches, stone, trees, and devotional layers. The first-century night would have held rock, grove, path, and the tension of footsteps approaching from the city. Jesus tells his disciples to pray that they may not enter into temptation, Luke 22:40. Then he withdraws farther, falls to the ground, and prays with a grief so heavy that the synoptics strain language to carry it. My soul is very sorrowful, even to death, Matthew 26:38. Luke says his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground, Luke 22:44, in a verse long discussed textually but preserved in much Christian memory. However, one handles the details, the scene remains unmistakable. Obedience here is not abstract, it is chosen under pressure. The cup is not named vaguely, it is the Father's will. The hour is not symbolic, it is imminent. The loneliness is not theatrical. The disciples sleep. There are scenes in Scripture where greatness appears in conquest, and scenes where it appears in endurance. Gethsemane belongs to the latter. Jesus does not win this chapter by force. He remains, he prays, he rises, he refuses both despair and escape. Not my will but yours be done, Luke 22:42. That sentence has steadied believers for centuries, but before it became comfort, it was spoken as submission inside a real night. Archaeology cannot recover the prayer itself. No trench opens into the heart of the Son before the Father. Yet, the location's continuity matters because the gospel memory of the scene is topographically sober. Jesus leaves the city after supper. He crosses to an accustomed place. Judas knows it. An arresting party can reach it in darkness. From there, the movement toward hearing, denial, trial, and dawn is swift. The narrative breathes the air of a city whose outskirts were used, known, and traversable. When Judas arrives, the violence of betrayal is almost quiet. A kiss in the synoptics, a self-identification in John. I am he, John 18:5-6. Men draw back and fall to the ground. Peter strikes with a sword. Jesus rebukes the gesture and heals the servant's ear in Luke 22:51. Once more, the details matter because they resist simplification. The arrest is not a heroic skirmish. It is a collapse of loyalties and options under torchlight. One disciple swings too late, another betrays by closeness, most flee. And still Jesus addresses the crowd as one who has chosen visibility from the beginning. Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. Luke 22:53. That line cuts in two directions. It exposes the cowardice of secrecy. It also reminds us that Jesus was publicly known. He did not emerge suddenly from private cult concealment. He taught openly in recognizable places. The arresting party needed a guide only because night changes the surface of familiar things. This chapter must be handled gently because piety has a way of sanding its hardest edges smooth. Gethsemane is not a decorative garden scene for devotional art. It is where obedience passes through the body. Knees bend to stone, breath shortens, friends fail to stay awake. The one who taught others to watch and pray watches alone while sleep claims those nearest him. For all that, the scene remains historically coherent in a way that matters. It belongs to the geography of Jerusalem's eastern approach, to the habits of nighttime movement, to the social reality that a known teacher could have familiar retreat places, and to the political urgency that made public arrest by daylight undesirable during a volatile feast. By the end of the chapter, the grove no longer matters to the officers. Their task is complete. But for the gospel witness, the place remains one of the clearest windows into the human obedience of Jesus. The one confessed as Son does not glide above dread. He goes through it. Hebrews will later say he offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. Hebrews 57:7. Gethsemane is where that line receives earth beneath it. Outside the wall,